Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Kerry Haynie, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Duke University, where he also directs the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Gender in the Social Sciences. How are you doing, Kerry?
Doing well, as best can be.
So, you're a political scientist. You must be busy.
Extremely so. I like to call this our tax season for political scientists, especially every 4 years when we have a presidential election.
There are a lot of think pieces. There's a lot of emotional spewing, if you will, that we see on social media. From a political scientist's point of view, what happened in November 2016?
Wow. From this particular political scientist's point of view, I think what we saw was the culmination of a decades-long effort on the part of the Republican Party to instill some racial anxiety and racial fear in the electorate. And I say instill and perhaps uncover what was already there. What Donald Trump did in his election, Mark, was to yell what the Republican Party has been whispering for the past decades. And an element of the electorate turned out and showed out on election day. And and it's disturbing in the sense that we thought we had passed that era of politics when the so-called dog whistle, overt racism of politics, and to see that emerge again in this campaign and to actually be successful is disturbing and frightening.
How much of it do you think has to do, legitimately or not, with the lack of a real recovery? There's a way in which you might think of the economic recovery over the last 8 years as being almost smoke and mirrors. The numbers say one thing, but the quality of people's lives say another thing. How much do you think folks were invested in Trump because of that?
I think at the margins, but I see it as a racial resentment message more than an economic resentment, in the sense that the people who got quite a bit of attention in this election, whites from the Midwest Rust Belt, Southern Appalachia, they've been depressed for decades. I mean, those areas have been, those factories have been, it's not brand new. Those factories have been closed for 20, 30 years. My hometown of Kannapolis, North Carolina, a textile town, that mill's been going for 20 years. And so that kind of resentment, it's hard for it to be long lasting. Those mills are not coming back. Those factories are not coming back, certainly not to the extent that they were in their heyday. So I focus less on the economic aspects and the racial aspects. I think Trump stirred up some racial resentment that's been underlying, not so far beneath the surface.
I've been watching, as you have these protests, and they are as vibrant as I remember them when I was a kid.
Yes.
Watching the last moments of anti-Vietnam protests.
Right.
And you will hear some of the older guard in talking to African-American folks, right? We survived Nixon. We survived 8 years of Reagan.
Right.
What's different about this Trump presidency, or what proposes to be different about a Trump presidency that might have been different from those 8 years of Reagan or those 6 years of Richard Nixon?
Let me tell you this. So I do a lot of coverage for print and radio and television media during the election. And often I would say to the outlets, and let me give you my priors on this. In the past, I've disagreed politically and ideologically with candidates. But this is the first time in my life where it was more than political and partisan disagreement. I had a distaste and a dislike for Trump, unlike any other candidate. Right. And the reason being, Ronald Reagan, which I disagreed with almost everything on, Ronald Reagan was not an overt racist, xenophobic politician.
And he governed, right? Even as he launched his campaign at the home of the Klan.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, he governed. But what Donald Trump did with no experience, right? This dog whistle and bullhorn politics, race baiting to the extent we hadn't seen since George Wallace. So it stirred up something in the country. And it was surprising to me and many people to see the amount of support he got, notwithstanding this overt racism. You know, in political science, we come to think that you can appeal to people in a covert way. You can do the sort of the dog whistle and people respond. But this guy had a bullhorn and yelled at the top of his lungs, and people came out of the woodwork to support this guy in numbers that I find frightening and disturbing.
What do you think about what has happened here in North Carolina? You know, just on the ground about the way the legislature has flipped the last 6 years. I mean, there's a great argument to be made. We have focused so much on national elections the last decade because of Barack Obama. And you could make the argument that on the local level, whether it was President John McCain or President Mitt Romney, that the day-to-day quality of life conditions for most black folks in this country on a local level would not have been any different than they were with Obama president, right? The only thing that might be different is that there was a level of expectation because it was an Obama presidency.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mark. And voters and citizens often misplace their expectations. The level of government that is the most powerful and one that we deal with most often is state and local, and particularly local government. Right. And we miss that, and we actually look to the national government to do what local government and state government is responsible for doing.
Right.
You know, here in this state, the HB2 bill, right, where this something known as the bathroom bill that discriminates against, you know, transgendered people. I mean, that's a local level bill that caused quite a bit of harm and hurt and put people at risk in this state. In this state where the legislature passed a voter ID bill that the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals called intentionally racially discriminatory with surgical precision, you know, to go after black folk. That's local level politics that matters, you know, just as much as anything on the national level.
What are the implications you think going forward, looking at the Supreme Court? You know, Ginsburg, who's getting up in years, Kennedy's getting up in years. I mean, we're talking possibly with 4 replacements over the next.
Could be
4 years, possibly.
Could be. Certainly, you know, we have one vacancy now that the new president will certainly name someone to that replacement. And depending on what happens, I mean, Justice Ginsburg is in her 80s, has been in failing health for a number of years, and she may or may not, you know, last the term. Justice Kennedy is in his high upper 70s. He may decide. So this new president will be able to shape the court for a generation. I suspect the Democrats will try to put up a fight. You know, they do have the filibuster at their disposal, and they may put up a fight to try to move the president from a far right-wing nominee to someone who's more towards the center.
When you look at the Democratic Party going forward, and them attempting to rebrand themselves, you know, do they go more to the center? Though I would argue that's probably some of the problem, or do they pivot left at this point in time, particularly when you think about the role of millennials, you know, as part of a voting bloc going forward?
You know, it's a good question. Now, some disturbing things that are happening, at least from my point of view, with Democrats now, some of the talk, if you look at who's buying the head the party, and some of the talk is to go after these white male voters that Trump appealed to this time. I think that's the wrong strategy.
With the lowest voting totals since George Bush in 2004. Right.
So quite a bit of the talk is to go after those voters. I mean, it reminds me of Democrats trying to recapture the so-called Reagan Democrats. They weren't Reagan Democrats, they were Republicans. And so for the party to be orienting itself to that demographic is a mistake when the larger nationwide demographic suggests that they should, I don't know whether it's moving left, but it's certainly moving to a more diverse party structure, party leadership in terms of Latinos and African Americans. That's where the growth is in the country, and also a new generation of voters that are on board. And I think millennials are up for grabs, and the party should be orienting itself in that direction as opposed to looking back for this demographic that you lost and that demographic is gone, I think.
If you were advising the Democratic Party right now, how would you advise them around their relationship with black voters? On the one hand, we heard all this rhetoric about, black folks failing to come out to vote. The data doesn't actually suggest that.
Right.
And at least not to the extent that Hillary Clinton lost the election.
That's right.
Right? It's
That's right.
the 53% of white women,
Right. That's right.
for instance,
That's
who
it.
voted,
Yes.
for Donald Trump. And yet, what you heard from millennials, was a very strong critique of thinking that they were being taken for granted as voters. I think Latino voters feel the same way, right? And while the 29% is probably not the right number, clearly Donald Trump did double digit,
Right.
even amongst, Latino voters. How do you advise the Democratic Party going forward around this particular voting bloc, right, which remains their most dedicated
Absolutely.
and consistent voting bloc?
Absolutely. It's not rocket science, to use that old adage. What could Democrats have to do? They have a built-in advantage. When we looked at this electoral college map going into the general election, most estimates had Secretary Clinton with well over 200 electoral college votes in the bag.
Right.
And she was a state or two from claiming victory. And I think that's real. If you look at the demographic groups that tend to vote Democratic,
Right.
if you look at the so-called Obama coalition, she had a built-in advantage. You would think, how in the hell could she lose?
Yeah.
But what you have to do is you can't take for granted that coalition is going to show up if you don't ask.
Right.
And so it's always been this rap against the Democrats that they've taken black voters for granted. And to some extent, I think that's true. I think it was certainly the case in this cycle where the Clinton campaign assumed that the coalition that showed up for Obama would show up for her, and not much effort needed to be made to make that happen. And I think that's a mistake. And especially with millennials. Millennials who tend not to be as partisan as older generations. You need to make an affirmative, compelling argument to get them to come out and vote for you. That's what then Senator Obama did in 2008,
Right.
followed up again with 2012. That didn't happen so much in this last election.
Let me flip this to an institutional question. I heard a fascinating stat a few days ago from Mike Schoenfeld, here at Duke, that if you look at the Ivy League schools and what would be called Ivy Plus schools, like Duke, Duke and the University of Pennsylvania are the only one of those schools that are in red states. And thinking about a challenge going forward, in terms of recruitment of diverse students to places like Duke, you have a unique story, right? You grew up here in North
Right.
Carolina,
Yes.
and your parents were very clear that,
Right.
that 30 years ago, you weren't going
Not coming
to Duke.
Right.
I can't imagine that if I was a 20-year-old or 18-year-old now, first generation student thinking about coming to Duke, and my parents are hearing about the potential of Klan rallies
Right.
and all this kind of stuff, that they would ever allow me,
Right.
to go down south. How does an institution pivot given those kind of realities? And that's not even to talk about international students,
Right.
who are now looking at the head of state now, who are now looking at the face of empire, and thinking about whether or not they want to travel across the world to come to the United States to go to school, let alone someplace like Duke.
Right. What institutions like Duke and others have to do is to take seriously the question and issue of diversity. And you can't do it just in a moment of crisis, right? You have to do it all the time. So you and I, here we are sitting here as members of the faculty, and we're here all the time. And to use our expertise, our being here, the number of students as ambassadors for the university.
Right.
Again, not in moments of crisis when we often get called upon to
Right,
help out.
to do things,
right.
yeah.
But when things are sort of in normalized times, you don't know whether they know that we even here. Right. And so I think that's important that the face of the university, that the normal and natural face of the university is reflective of what's actually here. And universities often, I think, fail to understand that point. In terms of when young people are looking to make a choice and their parents are looking to make a choice, they don't look awkward in times of crisis. They also look in times of what's going on a normal day-to-day basis. And we are quite present, and when there's an issue that requires at least our representation, we are visible, but then we often invisible otherwise.
Predictions.
Oh no.
Does Mr. Trump survive 4 years?
You know, I think it's if I was betting, I'd bet yes. But you know, a part of me wants to believe that, and I believe on some levels that he is now thinking, what in the hell have I gotten myself into? He doesn't want this. I never thought he wanted this, and now that he has it, I mean, the job is
his ego wouldn't allow him
right.
to say, I don't want to do this anymore, right? So his ego is the thing that kept him in the race.
Yeah, the job is a straitjacket. I mean, he's now in a straitjacket in ways that his personality doesn't suit his personality. I mean, now let's talk about, you know, wanting to live part of your time in New York and part in D.C. Who does that as president? I mean, how can you do that? I mean, so I don't think he's gotten his head around what it means to actually now that you have it. What's the old thing, you know, the dog chases the car. Now you catch it, what the hell do you do with it?
Right.
I think that's where Mr. Trump is at this moment, that, you know, he has this thing. So whether he'll survive or not, you know, I can see a scenario in which Trump will walk away from this thing, claim victory, and say to the Republicans, now I got you guys here. I've done my job. I'm going back to my business.
And leave us with Mike Pence.
Yeah, leave you know, Governor Pence as the president. But I can see him washing his hands of this. The other potential is there are some looming potential scandals.
Right.
Legal problems. I mean, he's in court now.
Trump University.
Right. There's been some allegations of sexual impropriety. We don't yet know what's in his tax returns. We don't yet know about his connections to
foreign businesses,
foreign
governments,
particularly in Russia, the Russian oligarchs, who often have connections to the underworld in Russia. So the things we don't know, and you know that these are a whole number of questions that have been raised that would be interesting to see what happens, if anything. With those.
It's almost as if when he talked about indicting Hillary Clinton, that he needed to have there to be some public response to it that says that you can't do that to protect
himself
him.
From, yeah. You know, it's almost, you know, just spinning conspiracy theories, but in this case, I mean, these are real possibilities, given what the record shows thus far.
That we, you know, haven't seen at least in 100 years in terms of presidential candidates.
Absolutely.
We've been joined today by Professor Kerry Haynie, who's Associate Professor of Political Science and African-American Studies here at Duke University. Thanks for joining us, Kerry.
Happy to be here, glad to be here. Let's do it again.
Yes.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy